Welcome, everybody, and thank you so much for coming to this, which is the second of our Citizens of the World in Conversation series. The aim of the series is to bring together interesting writers, poets, activists, others, to talk not necessarily about immigration and immigration-related topics, but very broadly, and to share ideas, because one of the good things about being of the no borders persuasion is that you believe in sharing things across borders. So that's what we're trying to do. We are, for those of you who don't know, and hopefully you all do, we are 1000 for 1000, which is a very, very small Brighton housing charity. We try to crowdfund rent from recurring micro donations every month to provide accommodation for people whom this government sees fit to make homeless for the non-crime of crossing a border. The idea is to be a little community response. If the government is going to have a hostile environment, then we will have a hospitable environment, and we will work to bring people in rather than to freeze them out. So that's what we do. You're very, very welcome, if you don't already, to sign up, subscribe to the project, whatever you can afford. We're convinced that homes can be made out of small change. So all we ask is that you put up your small change at the end of the month, and we will continue to rent homes for people. So that's who we are. We're very pleased to bring together, well, 3 people actually now, to have a conversation. Francis Webber of the Institute of Race Relations, author of Borderline Justice, retired immigration lawyer, and just a phenomenal thinker, I think, about the border and its politics. And Mr. Jana, for the founder and director of the Tamil Welfare Association of Newham, and a long time political activist and campaigner for refugee rights. And they're going to be having a conversation ably facilitated by immigration barrister and academic Joe Wilding, Dr. Joe Wilding now. So I'm going to shut up and pass over to Joe to start the conversation.
You're muted.
I muted myself to be quiet and then forgot to unmute myself. Thank you so much for inviting me, Jacob, to chair this. When I saw that the 2 of you were going to be in conversation with each other, I was very excited indeed, because Mr. Jana used to instruct me often as a barrister, and Francis kindly didn't murder me when, as a pupil barrister, I broke the photocopier. She's probably forgotten it, but I never have. So it's lovely to see you both. I will kick us off by asking Mr. Jana, could you talk to us a bit about your own story, how you came to be in the UK and form the Tamil Welfare Association, and perhaps take us up to the Earl William Ferry, since we've had recent suggestions from the Home Office that it might be a good idea again to start detaining refugees on ferries in the offshore, and then we'll move from there.
Yes, thank you. Yes, my name is people call Jana. Full name is Janarthanan, and I came to this country 16th of May 1985 as a refugee, because I had a problem in Sri Lanka, north of Sri Lanka. I was wanted by the security forces and another militant group as well. So I escaped from north and reached the Colombo, and on those days we don't need a entry visa to come to London. So when I reached the Colombo, I asked one of my friends to purchase the ticket for get out of the country. and he managed to get the ticket for UK. So I purchased the ticket and came to UK. And on 16th of May 85, I arrived at the Heathrow Airport Terminal 3. And in my flight, around 17 other Tamils claimed asylum, and most of them released on temporary admission or allowed to go inside. And 11 of us taken to detention center. And then after, we moved to Ashford Remand Center, and we kept there around a month time. And during that, when I asked the asylum at the Terminal 3, the officer got the brief details of my personal details. Then after asked me to sign, and he wrongfully put my name. And I asked him to change it. That's not my name. I given the passport, and according to the passport, it wasn't there. But he said, there's not enough space. It won't make any difference, and you can sign it. Then I signed it. I haven't got the choice. Then I moved to detention, and I was kept in the detention for a month. There are other Tamil detainees also there. Around 2 weeks later, one of the detainee taken to airport. His name Ravi, and he wasn't returned. We thought, we worried about him, and later we found out 2 days later he was deported. And similarly, another 8 people supposed to taken to, they were taken to Heathrow Airport again. After the first removal, we managed to, I was given one telephone number, and the person, another detainee, and another nationality detainee said, call this number, these people sometime able to help you. And I rang that number, and fortunately, other side, someone talked to me. I explained to our situation, how many detainees at the Ashford Remand Center and what is happened, and another 8 people taken to Heathrow Airport today and things like that. That's what I told them. And then the person took the phone call, called me back a few minutes later and asked for a reference numbers. I given the reference numbers over the phone. From the detention, we had a telephone system, so we used that public telephone and given that reference numbers. And it's happened to be MP Jeremy Corbyn's secretary's office, and they managed to put the stop order against the removal. Subsequently, all of our removals stopped, and we were released in 1 month later, around June, middle of June. And when we were released, airport immigration officers asked for addresses, and some people from East London Tamil people, they got together and they come forward and given the addresses and took us out. Then we settled in the East London, particularly in Newham area, and we rented out the houses or flats with our traveler checks or whatever available, and we start our life. And then later, late arrivals also started to come and join with us, ask for help and our experience. We started to share the experience. Also, Terminal 3 started to call the people for an interview. So I took them to airport. That's my duty, because whoever took us, they got the work in the daytime. They are unable to come to the airport. So responsible default to me, and I took the individual to airport, and in the morning 10 o'clock or something, then after the interview 4 o'clock, so I stayed there. We will come back. That's how we started. And later, in September 85, we decided to form a group, and we named the Tamil Welfare Association and started to work as a group, as a self-help group. In November 85, the Newham Council recognized our group and wanted to help the Tamil refugees. But Sri Lankan High Commission objected that idea. There was a council meeting took place at the Green Hill Center in Manor Park, and there was a picketing because Navaratne, the Assistant High Commissioner, wanted to come and give a speech, deliver the speech at the council meeting. And the outside the meeting chamber, there was a picketing. He delivered a speech. It was a angry exchange, and the High Commissioner simply told those people are terrorists and those people are not a refugees, genuine refugees. There are no refugees. That's what he mentioned. And when after the speech or meeting, when he got to the car, some whoever did some picketing, participated in the picketing, there was a clash and his car was damaged. And later, Forest Gate Police questioned me because I am also one of the organizers. For some reason, they haven't pressed the charge later on because I was inside the chamber, council chamber, when the meeting was held, and definitely they know I'm not one of them. So then after they dropped the charge. Since that day, I was monitored, or my details was with the Sri Lankan High Commission. My activities was monitored. Then we moved on, and council helped us initially. During this time, in November 85, 3 Tamil refugees were killed at the Burgess Road arson attack. After this incident, police blame is a rivalry groups fight. That's why the 3 people were killed. And after this incident, police started to arrest many Tamils standing outside the tube stations and other places, and started to question the Tamil youths particularly and take them into the Forest Gate or Eastern Police Station and things like that. We also, those 3 refugees, relatives or parents unable to come to UK. So as a group, we took the responsibility and did the funeral at the Manor Park Cemetery. We collected the money, and council also given some money, and we did the funeral. During this time, police harassment started to grow, and we gathered informations And finally, we met the policing minister at the Queen Anne's Gate, Central London, and he agreed to send the circular. And that circular was sent to all 32 borough police stations. And subsequently, police disappeared from the road and the tube stations. We also prepared the report how many arrests was made and how many people questioned during that time. After this incident, I applied for a lay visitors panel member and become a lay visitor and decided to visit to the police station and investigate or check the remand records. If anyone for immigration purpose held or kept more than 2 days or things like that, then we report to the main body and started to took action. Then that practice started to slow down by the police. During this time, we established some relationship or working pattern with the airports and other immigration centers to release the detainees. And due to our nature of work, we received sometimes we received phone calls from the immigration, particularly in 1986, December 24th or 25th, we received the call from the Gatwick immigration, and officers asked to release around 25 or 26 detainees. Tamil refugees were there and asked us to help to release them. And we went and we took them out and we brought them to East London and provide shelter. Similarly, we started to work with the detention centers or immigration office, try to release the detainees where possible. This practice grows, and later we heard about the Earls William because one of the detainee contacted us, and we decided to go and meet the particular person. Then after we decided to organize a campaign outside the Earls William in Harwich. The reason we campaigned against that ship or ferry, all the detainees kept in a bad condition, and they said their treatment wasn't good, and also it make them sick because all the time they are floating in the water, and also all the time they can see the blue, either sea or sky. So this kind of environment make them sick and too unhealthier. And also we made the government clear on that time to the Home Secretary, it wasn't a good idea because of the safety. People came here to save their life, and keep them in the sea is not a good idea. It is they have to remove, either those people have to be released or detained in the another proper safer detention centers. But the Home Secretary on that time, he refused, but kept them in the detention. We continuous every week. We used to go either Saturday or Sunday. We used to go to the Harwich, and we did the picketing. And local people also joined us. Around 25-30 people we gathered and did the picketing. 1 or 2 occasions, other MPs also joined with us. Dan Abbott and Jeremy Corbyn and like those MPs joined with us during that picketing. Suddenly in 87, there was a, due to bad weather, ship went away from the port. Then Coast Guard realized the risk, brought the ship back to the yard, and immediately Home Office or Immigration released all the detainees with temporary admission.
So this is sorry to interrupt you. So this is the point where the detainees finally came off the ferry, the Earl William.
That's correct. And
they'd been
during that time, sorry, during that time also, when they kept in the Earls William, we arranged local community people, Tamil people, and released them from the detention. And our organization managed to release at one point 63 Tamil detainees kept at the Earls William, 50 males and 13 females. We released around 22 people, and this is one press release after the 2 detainees released.
So this is quite a good example of where you have the refugees detained and you have the legal efforts to remove them, and at the same time the kind of the community efforts and the political efforts. And I think it's quite interesting that, as you said, you know, it was Jeremy Corbyn's office which intervened as the kind of the caseworkers rather than perhaps legal advice at the beginning. And so I'd like you to come to Francis now, if I may. I know that you're very sort of keen on the idea that you have legal and political campaigns moving in tandem. And I wondered if you could start by introducing kind of the work of the Institute for Race Relations and how that sort of transformed itself, if you like, from sort of academic to more of this sort of anti-racist think tank, if you like. And I think that's how it describes itself on the website.
Okay. Yeah, I was actually a secretary in the library at the Institute of Race Relations in 1969 to 70. And I was lucky enough to be working with Sivanandan, who subsequently, he sort of led a revolution in the Institute, because at that time it was run by, it was almost part of Chatham House. It was very establishment. It was very top down, looking at managing it, the people of the former colonies, and the people who were the trustees at the Institute of Race Relations at that time were people like shipping magnates, sugar magnates. I mean, all these sort of industrial giants were on the board of the Institute, along with academics who wrote about managing the population of people from the new Commonwealth, you know. So they were all very establishment. Sivanandan was absolutely not. He was a rebel through and through, fired by anger. When I was working there in 69 to 70, occasionally he would throw people down the stairs because they were, if they were sort of insulting or whatever. Many of the sort of white readers who came to the library would ask him where the librarian was, of course, because he was black, he was very dark, and they would always assume that the librarian was white. But anyway, so he led this revolution, which I won't go into it because I could be here all night just talking about that. In 1972, when he sort of organized the staff and then the membership, and there was an extraordinary general meeting when the old guard were all voted off and replaced by young sort of radical people who, I think Bishop Wilfred Wood was one. He was like the UK's first black bishop. I don't think he was a bishop then, but anyway, radical sociologists, people like that. And of course, that was the end of the money, because these trustees, the organization was quite wealthy then. The office was in Jermyn Street with all the tailored shirt manufacturers behind Fortnum and Mason. And it moved to King's Cross, and changed. So the journal, it was a sort of an anthropological kind of journal, really, called Race. So it was changed to Race and Class. And as you say, then it became, as in Siva's words, it became a sort of servicing station for, he would say, for liberation struggles. And it was a very exciting, I mean, by that time, I'd gone off to university, but I kept in touch with the Institute. And so although I left in 1970, I've been in touch with it ever since, actually. So yeah, that was the radical turn that the Institute took. And so rather than a sort of managerial top-down looking at the subjects or the objects, I'm not sure, looking at the objects of racism, it was looking up at racism itself, looking at and linking racism with colonialism, with capitalism, and looking at all the relations between those things. So yeah.
And that's interesting, isn't it? Because you have, at the same time as Mr. Jana arriving just before the British government imposed visa requirements on people coming from Sri Lanka, which was the first of Britain's former colonies to have visa requirements imposed, very much aimed at stopping that flow of refugees. And, you know, at the same time, you've got this sort of very radical, well, increasingly radical organisation looking at it from a different perspective. And Frances, do you think you brought those radical politics with you when you came into the law?
Oh, very much so, yes. When I went into the law, I wanted to do immigration because because of the politics of immigration at that time. By the time I became a barrister, it was 1979. And I came with that perspective, with an anti-racist perspective. So the thing about the visas that I just want to pick up on, and Mr. Jana will agree, I'm sure, is that the British government was... Who's that? Can you switch your microphone off? The British government was training the Sri Lankan army, wasn't it, Mr. Jana, and selling arms to Sri Lanka.
That's correct.
And so when the pogroms were, in 1983, the British government from then on was just saying, oh, they're all bogus. These people coming from Sri Lanka calling themselves refugees, they're bogus. Douglas Hurd, who was the Home Secretary at the time, yes, he was saying they're bogus. They're just coming to open corner shops. So you had that kind of those connections with the arms and the visa requirements and this kind of demonization of the asylum seeker, of the refugees from Sri Lanka. It was all happening sort of all together. Yeah.
Perhaps that's why it's so important in sort of, you know, in our work now, that equally it happens all together, you know, that, as you say, the legal, the political, the community organising all sort of going on.
And I just wanted to add that Mr. Jana and I, we've never met, but we are connected through that case in the High Court in February 1987, which was the same year as the Earl William, when I was trying to get into, well, I was doing a bit of immigration law. It was very difficult because it was considered too difficult for women to do. And so it was very tough for me to get cases. But anyway, on this particular day in February, I was rung up by, I think it might have been David Burgess. I'm not sure. Was it David Burgess, Mr. Jana?
Yes, David Burgess and Chris Randall represented.
And Chris Randall, that's right. So I was rung up by this brilliant, absolutely brilliant firm of immigration solicitors. They were so committed, absolutely 100%. And I was told that there were 58 Tamils who were being deported or removed from the country as refused asylum seekers. And in those days, there was no in-country right of appeal for people who arrived without visas, because as Joe says, visas were introduced it was unheard of before then, before 85, for Commonwealth citizens.
30th of June 85, they introduced the entry visa for Sri Lanka.
That's right. And Commonwealth citizens, in their passport, it says British subject, yeah? And so for a British subject to have a visa, I mean, it was unheard of before then. But this was the pattern then with all, whenever there was refugees having to run from a country, the government imposed visa requirements to make it impossible. Anyway, so in those days, you could, if you arrived without a visa, there was no right of appeal before removal. So these 58 were being removed. And I ran across, I literally had to run across because I was told they were on the tarmac. And I was told that they'd taken their trousers down so that they couldn't be put on the plane. So this is where you come in, Mr. Jana. So yes. You better explain what happened then.
Because when we met the detainees, we advised them or explained them what it could going to happen. And one side, we are taking the legal action. In the other hand, they have to start to fight for their own, because all of these detainees or deportees are going to be boarded in the plane with the other passenger plane. Therefore, they come up with their own idea to disturb that removal as far as possible. So that's how they did that kind of actions.
Yeah, it was brilliant. I just heard about it because I was literally running across to the High Court to find a judge to get an injunction to stop the removals. And when I went across, I had the name of one deportee. That's all I had. And I was hoping that the judge, that when we got an injunction in respect of that one, that everybody else would be released, would be taken off the plane, but they weren't. So I then had another phone call. I was told, well, they've taken that guy off, but there's 57 more. So then I had to get all the names of the 57 take them across to the High Court, to the same judge, and get injunctions for all of them separately. So it was quite a marathon, and all that time they were protesting on the tarmac to make sure they didn't get removed. Those were the days, eh?
But I think it's also quite interesting. It's easy to forget that now when you see the Home Office making these sort of series of awful decisions and detaining people and coming up with these terrible ideas of new ways of keeping refugees out and being unkind to them and difficult to them once they're here, it's easy to forget that actually every bit of that, the right to have a proper asylum interview, the right to have a representative, the right to have an appeal, all of that has been hard won, hasn't it?
Oh, God,
through
yes.
the courts. I think,
Yeah,
you know,
and
Borderline Justice, your book, Francis, really sort of puts together the cat and mouse of kind of fighting for justice on one hand and it being taken back with the other.
And of course, the bad, I mean, as a result of that case, then what happened the following month in March 87 was that the government passed the carrier's liability legislation, which actually was foundational in what we now think of as, you know, as this is why people have to travel illegally. This is why people have to get into small boats or have to get underneath lorries or, you know, be smuggled in lorries and take all those dreadful risks. I mean, the Institute has just published a report called Deadly Crossings, which is about the 297 people who have died since 1999 trying to cross the Channel to get to the UK. And it was the combination of the visa requirements and the carrier sanctions, carrier's liability, which made that happen, which caused those deaths. Because if there is no legal way, and there is no legal way for refugees to get to the UK, and it's the same all over Europe, because you can't travel without a visa, and you can't get a visa if you're a refugee, because you've got to be outside your own country. And once you're outside your own country, then they say, oh, well, you're safe now. So they won't give you a visa. So it's those two things, the visa controls and the carrier sanctions, which lead directly to what's happening now in the Channel. Yeah. And that happened, I'm afraid, probably as a result of that case, because those guys and everybody before had been able to arrive in the UK to claim asylum, and after that they couldn't arrive. They couldn't just get on a plane or a boat or anything. Yeah, and causing all the dreadful scenes that we've seen since then. And so from that, I know that Mr. Jana, obviously your organisation then moved into sort of legal representation. Now, bearing in mind that most people listening are not lawyers, so won't understand the sort of the detail of the legal case, could you just quickly talk us through how you got from, you know, the Earl William and the trousers down protest to becoming kind of a legal representative as well?
Yes, we slowly built up, started to help the other refugees, and started to provide more structured legal advice. In 88, two of our clients named Vadanan and Rajalingam detained at the Lashmi House in Richmond, and those people case again went to High Court, and we lost at the High Court. Subsequently, the case went to European Court, and we managed to overturn the High Court decision at the European Court of Human Rights. That's the first decision in this kind. Other 3 cases also listed together, and we won the case at the European Court.
That was Vilvaraja, the case of Vilvaraja. Yeah?
Vilvaraja and others. You are right. Yes.
All immigration lawyers know that case.
Yes. Yes. And among those two of our clients, so we did the picketing in the Lakshmi House many times, and subsequently those people's removal stopped because of the intervention of the European Human Rights Court.
Mhm.
These kind of actions and the practice created among the community more reputable as an organization or trustworthy or something like that. So more people started to come and ask for help. We, wherever possible, we try to help them releasing from the detention or finding the sureties to release those detainees or put the stop order against the removal. Unfortunately, in '89, Parliament made the decision MPs cannot intervene on the removals of the refugees. So after '89, MPs cannot be able to put the stop order. So all started to go for a legal challenge. So every cases, then we started to challenge wherever possible, and many deportation prevented. Then organization also started to grow. In 1990, we funded by the local authority for 2 years. Later, we funded by the National Lottery Board, and we managed to employ a full-time workers during that time. In 2003, we obtained the Specialist Quality Mark and Legal Aid contract, and we managed to employ qualified lawyers to work for us. Like that, organization started to grow, and we started to take up cases and do the challenges. These days, in our experience, our most income is coming from the GLD, because every time Home Office is losing the cases, cost paid to us. So nearly 85,000 per year we are getting from the GLD, because Home Office is losing the argument or at the court. So this is how we currently are challenging, and also in the other way, we are continuously making the representation to parliamentary subcommittees when they are making the law, and these type of publications, law, parliamentary subcommittees. When the Sri Lanka included in the white list country, we made the representation to parliamentary subcommittee. Sometimes we will take some of the clients to give evidence in the front of the committee.
Mr. Jana?
Yes.
What's GLB?
GLD, Government Legal Department.
Ah, okay.
They are those people giving the money, and every time Home Office losing on behalf of the Home Office,
okay.
Government Legal Department.
Okay.
Yes,
the other thing is
the government legal department represents the Home Office whenever it gets into legal trouble.
Can you just also say what the whitelist is? Because people don't know what the whitelist is.
Initially, Sri Lanka also included in the whitelist, and we challenged that decision, and we made many representation to Home Office, and also we had a meeting with the Home Office.
Yeah, but hang on a minute. You haven't told people what the whitelist is. It was a list of safe countries where people could be, they said it was safe to go back, yeah?
That's correct.
Okay.
Yes, government introduced in middle of 90s, that I think in 94 or 95, the government introduced the whitelist countries. That means those countries are safe. Those people cases cannot, no need to be heard, and without a
No, I think it was New Labour that introduced the whitelist. I think it was probably 10 years later, about 2004, in the 2004 Act, or the, so I think so.
Right,
Anyway,
maybe.
But it's not something you can get to quickly.
Not to worry. It's just that in relation to asylum,
Yes,
New Labour was as bad as the Tories. Wouldn't you agree?
yes, that's correct.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really important point, isn't it? Because no matter what the government has been, there's been this constant sort of pushback against the humanitarian sort of impulses of many of us to say we should be looking after refugees. And certainly, if you look at this kind of, like you say, that what we referred to earlier, this sort of cat and mouse, it's not as if you get any reprieve from that when you get a government that you might have hoped would be more sympathetic. And I think it's quite interesting what you say about feeding into those parliamentary inquiries, Mr. Jana. So you've got this sort of fight on all fronts, like you're still making submissions to parliamentary inquiries, even as the Home Office sort of builds up this repression. I think the other interesting point that's come out of what you've just said is also about those cases that you took to the European Court that made a huge difference.
Yes.
It's worth remembering that that was before the Human Rights Act came into force, wasn't it? That was long before we actually had the Human Rights Act and the ability to take those cases directly through the domestic courts. And I know, Francis, that was something that you were sort of trying to force into the domestic courts case law, you know, before the Human Rights Act came in. And I really wanted to emphasize that, just because, you know, as much as the Human Rights Act is under threat, and I think everybody should be under no illusion that we need to fight to kind of retain it, we don't give up on anything just because the Human Rights Act is under threat. You know, those are fights we'll still be having years and years down the line.
Yes, but the real threat, I think now, is the possibility of actually leaving the European Court of Human Rights. I mean, what the Human Rights Act did, as you say, it enabled us to take cases based on human rights in the UK. But the Human Rights Act, what it does, it incorporates the European Convention on Human Rights into domestic law. But if we're no longer part of the European Convention on Human Rights, which is, there are people in this government who are mooting that. So that is a real worry. And I think the only European country that is not in the European Convention on Human Rights is Belarus. So it would be Britain and Belarus if we came out. But I remember during the referendum campaign, Theresa May said she would rather leave the European Court of Human Rights than leave the EU. So, you know, that is a real possibility, that, and that's what we've got to really focus on, you know.
And I suppose my big question would be, that being the case, you know, the Human Rights Act gets very bad press, and we've talked a bit about how immigration law has become steadily more repressive, but at the same time, legal aid has been kind of squeezed to the point that it's a real struggle for legal aid providers like Mr. Jana's to survive. Brighton now only has one legal aid provider, which has shrunk and shrunk and shrunk, that's doing immigration work. So there's this real squeeze on legal aid at the same time as a squeeze on rights, at the same time as a very sort of hostile press towards migrants, towards refugees, towards legal aid, towards the Human Rights Act. So how do you fight that? How do we fight that through our sort of community organising, our legal campaigns and our political campaigns? That's a big question, but I'm confident we've got the answers.
Well, I think, yes. At the same time, there's a lot to be optimistic about, because, you know, we've had this huge movement for racial justice kicking off in the summer. But even before that, this refugee crisis, or the arrival of the refugee crisis into Europe, I think it's created a whole sort of generation of young people who spend their lives, you know, working, like in Calais, in Lesbos, all over in the borderlands, you know, the border bottlenecks, working with refugees, doing humanitarian work, doing feeding and sheltering and helping with legal issues. So there is this huge idealistic movement right across Europe. There's the Black Lives Matter movement. There's a lot more union activity around migrant workers than there's ever been. And the union, you know, the unions that have been set up by and for migrant workers, like IWGB, United Voices of the World, they've been having some fantastic victories, sort of insourcing previously outsourced workers in universities, in hospitals, etc., etc. So there's a huge amount going on politically. There's a lot going on at the grassroots. There's a lot of really, really interesting new ideas. You know, people have adopted those ideas from policing about defunding, about using some of the money that goes towards ever more militarized policing to put it back into youth clubs and youth provision and health provision and all the rest of it. There's a similar ideas going on in terms of immigration, that you know, the idea of they call it abolitionism, but it's basically, the idea is stop spending billions and billions on ever more vicious sort of fences around the motorway in Calais, around the tunnel in Coquel. The vast amounts of money that are spent on immigration policing and enforcement, and, you know, all these deportation flights, which have like 80 escorts for about 20 people or whatever. The amount of money that is spent, that goes to private companies, it's always private companies, Serco and this and that. But that's irrelevant, really. The amount of money that goes on immigration policing and on reinforcing borders, what that could do in terms of improving people's lives, in terms of, you know, increasing the minimum wage, of ensuring that migrant workers can live, ensuring that asylum seekers have a decent standard of living, you know, while they wait for a decision or whatever. There's so much there. Anyway, these are all, so there's a real struggle going on, both in terms of the politics, but also the ideas behind the policies.
And I've a colleague at the university who is part of this alarm phone network, where they answer the phone to people who are desperate and drifting at sea, and they try and get the humanitarian boats out to them, and they try and get the coast guards out to them. And just the idea that you have people just doing this from their own homes, while governments absolutely refuse to, not only to rescue those people, but even to let them dock. And it just feels like things are the wrong way around a bit.
Oh yeah, and I mean, people have been, you know, charged with criminal offences, very serious criminal offences, for performing sea rescues in off the coasts of Greece and Italy. And now I think there's only one NGO, humanitarian search and rescue boat that's actually out there at the moment in the central Mediterranean, because the others have all been kind of impounded or detained in port on various pretexts. So yes, it's terrifying because the EU and Europe will do anything to sort of close those borders to stop people coming. They've done these dreadful deals with Libya, you know, with the Libyan Coast Guard. People are being returned to Libya to the most horrendous sort of conditions in these detention centers where there's torture and God knows what goes on. But there is also an army of people fighting that. But what we need is to link up all these struggles, all of the struggles, you know, against racist policing, against racist immigration policing.
Which very much links into your description, Mr. Jana, of how it was, you know, for the Tamils in the 80s. I'm going to open up to questions in just a moment, but I just wanted to finish by asking Mr. Jana, do you agree with Francis on, you know, where the hope is in terms of the sort of the community organising and the army of people that's trying to improve things?
Can you repeat that one? How?
I just wondered whether you agree with Francis that there's you know, as much as there's a lot of sort of unpleasant pressure in terms of the squeeze on people's rights, you know, do you agree with Francis that there's this sort of hope in terms of the army of people that are trying to campaign for things to be better? Is that something you're seeing as well?
That's correct. As a community, as a organization, we have to campaign continuously and explain to the general public and the governments who are making the laws to explain whether they are accepting or not. We need to explain, we need to give the evidence. In the other hand, wherever possible, whether Home Office is accepting or not, we need to put our views to the Home Office as well. Particularly, we all the time we challenge with the challenging the Home Office with the country guidance report. Many errors there, and we are, because that's the immigration judges or Home Office decision makers making the decision based on that country guidance report. So we are challenging that report at that Home Office level as well, and also at the court level as well. So we need to, whether people, general public or decision makers accepting or not, we need to put it our views, why it is wrong and where is it wrong or like that. So campaign, we need to continue. In the other hand, we have to continue the legal challenges as we are continuing. The legal aid point of view, yes, since 2013, there's no legal aid for immigration work. Only asylum cases can be legal aided. So like that, the government continuously try to cut and chop the legal aid as well. So it may be, yes, difficult for our future as well with a legal aid perspective, yes.
So pulling on the power of stories at the same time as we sort of use that kind of legal expertise.
Yes.
Yes, and so Jacob has just made the point that the EU's Trust for the Development of Africa is used to fund border securitization in Morocco. So it's very much that sort of the need to defund the securitization of borders, isn't it?
And it's not just Morocco, it's also Sudan deals with Eritrea, with Ethiopia, with Sudan, with all the Sahel countries, with the countries in West Africa, and all of those countries are being told you won't get any development aid unless you control or stop migration from or through your countries. So it's sort of it's outsourcing of immigration control to countries in Africa and the Middle East.
Yes, just as much as within the country, within the sort of the physical geographical border, you have this sort of outsourcing of immigration controls via the Immigration Act.
Yeah,
you know,
everywhere.
if I take on an employee, if I take on a, you know, as an academic, I was always having to check the, you know, sign the papers for my students to say they turned up to lectures, and all of this sort of, to the doctors, to the landlords, to the banks, to the registrars.
Yeah, absolutely. But as I say, it started in the 80s with carrier's liability, because then it was people bringing, it was the airlines and the shipping companies bringing passengers to the UK who were turned into unpaid immigration officers, and and then it was extended to all these other other groups, including employers and landlords now and all the rest of it. Yeah. And it's also worth, sorry.
I was going to say, beware of what you tolerate today, because it's going to be worse by tomorrow, or, you know, a few years down the line. Just want to encourage everyone to pop your questions into the chat, and I'm going to now launch into the first one, which is one from Jacob. Can I ask about the use of detention? My folk history, if you like, is that although it existed prior to 97, it was really a new Labour innovation. Mr. Jana talked a lot about detention in the 80s. Is my folk history just wrong? Go for it.
Sorry?
Well, the thing is that, I mean, people were detained. Harmondsworth was going in, was it 79? Yeah, and it was private. I mean,
but it's fair to say there was an exponential increase, wasn't it? The capacity essentially doubled year on year from, you know, New Labour deciding.
Yeah, I mean, it went. I think the size of the detention estate increased from something like a couple of hundred in the very early 90s, 91, I think, to what is it, 4,000 now?
It's something like that, yeah. It doubled each year for several years.
It exponentially, yeah, increased, yes.
So I think you're right, Jacob, in the sense that people tended to be detained in prison facilities, didn't they, and remand facilities, and then obviously the Earl William Ferry was a dedicated site for refugees that was as thoroughly unsuitable as possible, and then you see that reflected now, don't you, in the sort of the barracks being used as camps, and the idea that, you know, perhaps we should detain people offshore in an Australian style detention system and so on. So I think you're right, Jacob, to say it was primarily a plank of New Labour. Do feel free, everyone, to post your questions in the chat. Or wave a hand if you would like to ask it in person. I think I should be able to see hands waving. Well, okay, if everyone's going to be shy, I'm going to ask another question, which is about how, which organisations really have been sort of allies in the cause of trying to sort of boost refugee rights, and which ones have been enemies, if you like. Have anybody have any thoughts? Organisations, I suppose statutory bodies that have been helpful. And I know we talked a little about the frustration of dealing with certain local authorities before the audience was able to join us.
These days, local authorities are not helpful. And also similarly other authorities like health authorities or like that, those body also started to keep the distance from the refugees or immigration, limitedly migrants, especially when it comes to the coast with the limitedly people or asylum seekers. Many GPs don't want to register asylum seekers as their patient. And also hospitals are, before they started to give treatment, they wanted even ambulance these days asking for a immigration status or how you are going to pay. Are you eligible for free medicine or treatment, like that questions. So authorities are also moving away from helpful to migrants instead of doing their job. That's how the system is now going.
So it sounds like perhaps there's a role for advocacy for people that support, support people who have arrived as refugees and as migrants.
Can I just add
Yeah.
something to that?
Yeah, please do.
Because I think that the hostile environment, an important and integral feature of it is the sort of anti-migrant propaganda, if you like, which enables people to feel okay about checking up on, and refusing a job or refusing to rent a flat or whatever on the basis of somebody's immigration status. And I think that, that the way in which successive governments, ably abetted by the media, have demonized migrants and asylum seekers over the years, so much so that, these words are kind of dirty words now. It affects the relationships between, say, for example, what Mr. Jana was saying about GPs. It affects the doctor-patient relationship when people working in hospitals, medical staff, have to check up on the immigration status of the people that they treat. And it's bound to, if you start thinking of people as cheats or as potential cheats. So by introducing that whole idea of health tourists, or benefit tourists or benefit scroungers or whatever, or bogus asylum seekers, immediately there is a kind of a wall of suspicion that is thrown up between the professional people who are supposed to be providing a professional service, and the people they're supposed to be providing that service to. And it's, yeah.
And what I'm wondering is, as an organisation, as a community organisation that 1,000 for 1,000 is, if someone were to, for example, go along with someone to the GP to advocate for them, is that a thing that's helpful, or is that a thing that sort of feeds that prevailing racism that, you're somehow legitimate if, but only if you've got, a native, a local person with you to advocate for you? Is it the positive, or does it feed the negative?
Why should it be a native person?
Well, this is what I'm wondering. I mean, Brighton is a very
shouldn't
be a native person.
It should be a person from the community organisation, somebody like Mr. Jana. Then it doesn't feed into any kind of racism. And that, I think, is what a lot of groups do. I mean, I know groups like Kalayan and Kanlungan who work with, who are domestic workers, and they all help each other, and they've all joined unions, and they all advocate they will advocate for each other. So it's not a question of bringing in some white expert. thank God, those days are gone. So yeah, there's a lot going on in those
Yes.
community organizations, particularly now with the pandemic. You know, they've never been more necessary, actually.
We are also spending some more time at the office to negotiating with the GPs to register for the newcomers, and negotiating with the landlords about the immigration status and their eligibility to rent out their house or continue to live in their property. And again, the employers, when the visa is expiring limited leave, we are explaining or giving the letters to the employers what they can do and things like that. So in many ways, we are dealing with those matters in day-to-day work. Yes.
We've had a question posted asking you to say a little more about the state of race relations in this country at the moment and how that's contributing to the justification of the UK's and EU's immigration policies. I don't know if either of you have thoughts on that.
Well, all I would say is the government, this government in particular, it denies the existence of structural racism. So, for example, the racism of the immigration system, the enforcement system, or the policing, it denies, for this government, and maybe for previous governments, but not to the same extent, racism is simply interpersonal sort of prejudice. And so it got to the point where the recent three recent appointments that the Prime Minister has made to the Equality and Human Rights Commission, and this new thing that he's set up, this racial and ethnic disparities unit, they're all people who don't believe in structural racism, and who say that anybody who talks about structural or institutional racism is promoting a sort of victimology. And that woman, Kemi Badenoch, who's women and equalities minister, she actually at one point said that it was illegal for teachers to teach about critical race theory. So anything which sort of suggests that there is any kind of structural racism, there's a suggestion that it's even illegal to teach it. And that's very dangerous, because you know, if you try and say, well, there's no such thing as institutional racism, that anybody who talks about it is promoting a victim ideology, then it means that anybody who is affected by that is either got to shut up, or, you know, that they're just not taken seriously.
So it's almost like as soon as the idea of structural racism starts to get a hold within the population and people start to say, oh, that's a thing, there's this backlash where, you know, it's...
Well, exactly. I mean, that's because that's what Black Lives Matter was all about, was saying, look at this structural racism. And so the government is saying, no, it doesn't exist. If young Black people are stopped in the street sort of 14 times more often than young white people, it's because they're criminals.
14 times more likely to need stopping.
Yeah. I mean, Cressida Dick actually said that. She said it's because they're criminals. That's why we stop them. I mean, it's breathtaking, actually.
And is that something, Mr. Jana, that you're seeing among young Tamils as well, this sort of continued over-policing in the community?
That's correct, yes. As I mentioned, in the 1986, when those the murder happened through letterbox arson attack, initially they arrested few Tamil people and tried to convict them. Then police failed that one. In result, they started to arrest many Tamils, so question many Tamils. Then we started to put the pressure on the police. Finally, in 90s, they tried to, they captured real culprit, and those people convicted later on. If we don't continue to put the pressure on the police on that particular matter, then police not going to continue their investigation and not going to find the real person who behind that attack. So similarly, these days also slightly there's a change. Instead of police, immigration vans are going around with the police and doing the stop and search for individuals. Still, young Tamils scared to move around freely because of this stop and search. And many police still, they don't understand about the temporary admission and the passport requirement, those kind of things. So sometimes, even if the particular police officer knew, they are using that one to take that person to get the fingerprints and the other personal identity data, which may helpful them to for other inquiries and things like that, DNA and other purpose. That's why they are purposely arresting under the suspicion of some other reason and taking the individual's all data. That's what's happening at the moment.
Yeah, and certainly that's something that a lot of organisations in London have told me they're seeing with rough sleepers, and the police trying to, police and immigration, and on occasion homeless charities working together, picking people up off the streets. And I know that some of the homelessness workers have said, well, we work with the Home Office because it's heartbreaking when you see people just die on the streets, which obviously it must be. But then the answer to that is not to work with the police, but to get rid of the hostile environment so that people are not rough sleeping because they're migrants and are not unable to be helped off the streets because they're migrants. It's sort of the wrong solution.
Yeah, and I mean, it's absolutely shocking that even during the first lockdown, when the borders were closed, when you think about the purpose of the hostile environment, all those policies was to make life impossible for people so they would leave the country. But those policies continued even when it was physically impossible to leave the country, which tells you something about the true purpose of those policies. And they're still there. They're still there. People are being made utterly destitute. As you know, Mr. Jana, you must be working with a lot of people who are unable to have recourse to public funds.
Yes.
Must be pretty desperate.
That's correct. Yes, we are making at least 2 applications per week for remove the arrears to public funds to get the help. Since March 2020, we are making like that. And also fee exemption visa renewal application these days taking more time, but we are doing that kind of work as well, because many limitedly families or people unable to pay the home office fees, and they need, when they become unemployed, they need to claim some benefit support.
Yeah,
that's correct. Yes, it is increased day-to-day work hour.
Yes, I mean, that's certainly something that's come up in the research that I've been doing, that, you have to not only get someone the leave to remain in the first place, and apply for a fee waiver because the fees are so expensive.
Yeah.
You then have to apply afterwards for their no recourse condition to be lifted. And then because they get these 2.5-year periods of leave for a 10-year period, it massively increases the demand on the few free services or low-cost services that are out there. You know, because they're having to make 3 applications 4 times over in effect, and the difficulty of keeping people on that 10-year route to settlement and stopping them falling off the route to settlement because they simply can't afford to stay documented. You know, it's just, it's not just a hostile environment, it's gone completely sort of bananas.
Yeah. I want to, can I answer Sue's question?
Yes, please do.
No
Yeah.
recourse to public funds, because up until about 1993, I think it was, or 96, my immigrants were entitled to the same benefits as everybody else, except they were on a sort of 10% less. And I was involved in a case in 1996 where the regulations were brought in under the Social Security Act, which said that asylum seekers who didn't claim asylum immediately on arrival, or asylum seekers who were refused asylum but put in an appeal, were not entitled to any benefits at all. We took that case to the Court of Appeal and we won it. So the government then passed primary legislation to deny benefits to asylum seekers. And so then local authorities had to step in. Some people discovered that there was still the National Assistance Act 1948 obliged local authorities to look after people who were, I can't remember the exact phrase, but people who were in need in their local authority area. Then when New Labour came in, they said they were going to have a review, and everybody, well, a lot of people who should have known better were very excited, thinking, oh, you know, Labour, they're going to really improve things and restore benefits to asylum seekers. So what New Labour did, I think it was also the 2002 Act, they took migrants and asylum seekers out of all state benefits, all the non-contributory state benefits completely. And they introduced this NAS, asylum support, which was, you know, no choice, slum housing dispersed all over the country. And yeah, and so there was nothing for migrants for 5 years, and for asylum seekers it was just this kind of
subsistence benefits.
Yeah.
Just to jump in, I mean, I think the thing that's so shocking about the no recourse to public funds system is, isn't it, that it might be somebody has leave to remain on the basis that they've got a British child, or a child who has leave to remain on the basis of long residence, and they're then prevented from having access to the benefit system that anyone else would have just because of their immigration status, even at risk of putting that child into dire poverty. I'm conscious that we are effectively out of time, Jacob. Do I need to wrap us up?
I think that would probably be good, I think.
A good moment. So can I thank you both so much for being here? I think from the comments, people have found this, I can see some applause over there, a really useful and interesting conversation. I know people have found your story, Mr. Jana, very empowering to hear, and found the whole thing very interesting. Just to read out a couple of these things, the 1000 for 1000 has a loan fund which lends interest-free money for visa fee renewal. So as well as housing people, if you want to make your micro donation of as little as £1 a month, you can be part of the lovely 1,000 for 1,000 community. You get Jacob's brilliant, cheery, sunshiny updates once a month or so. And you get to make it a more hospitable environment, fight directly the hostile environment. So do think of joining 1,000 for 1,000. But I had better stop talking and just thank everyone for being here. Jacob, did you want to say anything to close? Or shall we just wave?
No, well, no, but I mean, now I'm going to have to. I mean, you've said it all. I mean, thank you everybody so much for coming, and thank you so much, Francis. Thank you so much, Mr. Jana. That like really brilliant, thought-provoking conversation, at least for me. You know, just when you think you've got your handle on how awful it is, you realise that you haven't yet scratched the surface, the depth of the horror that is the Home Office.
But at the same time, as Francis said, lots of hope in terms of the kind of community resistance that's going on.
No, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. That's where I did want to end. You know, in some ways, my you know, you could see the story. Perhaps this is wrong in terms of a move from an idea of a Commonwealth, where everybody in that Commonwealth is, in some sense, British, in that sense, entitled to the protection of the law, to a system where, you know, first with the visa imposition and then carrier liability, and to slowly push everybody out and to turn, at least sort of legally, to link Britishness with whiteness within the law, and to keep people out. But at the same time, I think the enormous, fantastic work done by groups like the IRR and the Tamil Welfare Association, and hopefully our own, to resist that and to bring a different kind of politics and change to make sure that the law protects everybody, or should, rather than excludes, and that all of us can be together in the community that we find ourselves thrown together in, and that, I think, fundamentally is the real problem with hostile environment. Is this idea that some people can be kept outside of the protection of the law, and left to violence, and we have to work to bring people in, and that's exactly what we're doing.
Thank you, Jacob, for inviting me. It was really, really good. It was great to meet you, Mr. Jana.
Yes.
And to hear your story too. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity to, yeah,
and thank you, Joe, for such a fantastic facilitation.
Thanks for having me.
And we will be back hopefully next month with some more Citizens of the World in Conversation. Not quite sure what yet, but possibly some Western Saharan poetry, possibly some Senegalese alarm phone activists, depending on who pops up. We'll see you all then. Thank you all for coming. Have a lovely Christmas.
And you.
Stay safe.
Okay. Bye-bye.
okay, bye.
Thanks, Joe.
Thank you, friend.